Okay, in Mark chapter 10, we find Jesus traveling with his disciples, teaching the crowds as he goes. At the start of the story, Jesus and his crew have been in Jericho, and now they're headed back out of town towards Jerusalem. This particular encounter happens on the edge of town, where we find Jesus, his disciples, a large crowd, and a blind man named Bartimaeus. So who is this Bartimaeus? This is our first encounter with him in the text. And although a similar story of a blind beggar in Jericho is found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is only here in Mark that this man has a name, Bartimaeus. We don't know much about him. We don't know his age or his backstory. We do know that he was the son of someone named Timaeus, because that's what his name translates into in the original Aramaic. The only other details we have are that Bartimaeus is now a blind beggar, which means that he was socially excluded, unable to work, unable to keep his own household, or fulfill civic or religious obligations. In a time not so unlike our own, those who could not produce or earn their keep were kept on the fringe of society, the poorest of the poor. Bartimaeus is an outsider, living outside the city, outside the economy, outside the path. The world does not treat him kindly. We can assume that he's been on the side of this road, blind, for a long time. I'm guessing he was tired of crying out, tired of asking for help or relying on the kindness or not of those who passed him by. Maybe he was becoming resigned to his fate. Perhaps he was already on the verge of giving up or giving into the darkness. And that's where our story finds him. He hears someone coming. There's a crowd moving with them. Maybe it's someone important. And then he knows, deep in his soul, he knows without seeing him who it is. And he knows that this time his cries must be heard. He cries out. His life depends on it. We can hear the venom and the assumed unworthiness and the shushing and the cruel words of those who are trying to silence him. The text tells us that the people sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he will not be silenced, not this time. His response to the shushing is to cry out even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." We know that Jesus and his disciples were in a large crowd at this point, surrounded by a throng of people who had flocked to see this teacher of growing fame. It would have been a very loud situation. Somewhere, though, on the side of the road, one voice cries out, and somehow Jesus hears him. The text tells us that in the midst of all this chaos, Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And then it seems that the attitude of the crowd has shifted. Those who have just been silencing Bartimaeus help him up, congratulate him, take him with them, say, "Take heart, he is teaching you," or "He is calling you." We read that in response, Bartimaeus threw off his cloak and sprang up, rushing to the side of Jesus. The description of his response might seem like a little thing, easy to overlook, but I feel like we should sit with it for a second and really imagine what it would have looked like or felt like. I don't reckon that this man, Bartimaeus, did a lot of springing up, not in his everyday life or at all. It doesn't seem like there was much in his life worth springing up for. But now the day has come. Someone has heard his cries for mercy, and not just anyone, but the Lord of life. The Lord of life has heard him and has the power to change his life. And so the blind man does spring up, and he rushes to the side of the Savior. When Bartimaeus reaches Jesus, Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus knows exactly what he'll ask. As shocked as he probably is that this is actually happening for him, the words form clearly. "My teacher, let me see again." Can you just imagine it? Jesus smiling, knowing that he can restore what has been lost, and replying to this man, "Go, your faith has made you well." And just like that, immediately, Bartimaeus regains his sight. And just like that, the story kind of ends. It's the end of what we know about Bartimaeus. Onward the adventures go for Jesus and company, and all we know is that Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way, and that's the last we hear of him. What a ride. What a story. But what is this word speaking to us in our context? in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of our semester, what lesson might we learn? I think that there are a lot of things we could take away from this story about Bartimaeus. We could learn from his tenacity, his hope, his courage. But in keeping with our ongoing theme of the semester, our theme of unafraid, what stands out to me the most is what Bartimaeus can teach us about faith over fear. To get more deeply into that, we have to backtrack in the story and go back a little bit in the text. There's a little bitty part of the narrative that we all probably looked right past. I know I did when I first read the story. The cloak. Do any of you remember anything about Bartimaeus?
He ripped it off.
That's right.
Aggressive.
I'm surprised you caught that.
I read it.
In verse 50, we read that Bartimaeus, his reaction to Jesus is to throw off his cloak and to spring up and go to Jesus' side. He threw it off, like you said. There is nothing in the text that suggests that he ever went back for it. And throwing off a cloak might seem like a small thing, but I read a scholarly article by a Bible scholar and realized that the cloak here is not just a garment. For someone living below the poverty line in this time, the cloak would be precious. This would be what provided them with warmth and protection if the weather got bad. It could serve as a pillow or a blanket if the ground was hard. It could even be something for him to lay in front of him to collect beggars' scraps or money as he begged on the side of the road. So this meager cloak is actually Bartimaeus' only possession, in which case when he leaves it behind, he leaves all that he has to follow Jesus. Does that ring any bells for anybody? Yeah. Maybe it reminds you of the story that's just before this in Mark, where the rich man asks Jesus what he needs to do to enter the kingdom of heaven. What does Jesus answer? Anybody remember? Yep, he has to sell everything he has and give that to the poor, which turns out to be too big of an ask for this guy, and he fails. But in contrast here, we see Bartimaeus leave his only possession behind and follows Jesus without even being asked. Jesus calls us, as he called Bartimaeus, to trust in him. It would have been really easy for Bartimaeus to go back for his cloak, to pack it for the journey. He's following Jesus on the way. Maybe he needs to pack his cloak just in case. It would be easy for him to cling to the little security that this cloak has given him over the years. But discipleship requires us to let go of the false securities that we hold so tightly, to fully trust that following Jesus in the way is enough. When we let our cloaks go, we will be free to see the ways that Jesus is leading us from darkness into light, from sitting alongside the path to walking the path with him. So this week, my challenge to you is to consider the cloaks that you might be holding, and to think about what is something that you could leave behind this week to fully lean on Jesus and lean more into his promise to walk along this way with you. That's your challenge.